The R-37M is not a missile designed for the kind of air combat most pilots train for. It is not a close-range, high maneuverability weapon built to track a fighter through a defensive brake turn at 5 kilometers. It is something conceptually different. A long-range denial weapon designed to reach out across 300 kilometers of airspace and remove an aircraft from the picture before any conventional intercept geometry can develop. At Mach 6 in the terminal phase, it covers 300 kilometers in under 4 minutes. Its minimum effective engagement range, the distance inside which the seeker cannot complete its terminal guidance sequence, is classified. Open-source estimates place it somewhere between 30 and 50 kilometers. That range band, that thin ring of airspace close to the launching aircraft, is the only place the R-37M cannot reach.
The problem with getting inside that ring is the aircraft that carries the R-37M.
The MiG-31BM Foxhound was not designed to be an agile close-range fighter. It was designed to be a platform for exactly this concept. A fast, high-altitude launch rail that could position the R-37M at maximum range and stand off while the missile did the work. At Mach 2.83 and 70,000 feet, the MiG-31 can reach its launch position before most fighters can close to intercept range. Its Zaslon-M phased array radar has a detection range against large targets exceeding 400 kilometers. It does not need to maneuver. It does not need to get close. It needs to position, find the target, and release. Then the mathematics handle everything else. The only variable the mathematics cannot handle is an aircraft it cannot find. At 6:33 a.m. on a clear September morning over the Beaufort Sea, that variable was already airborne. The NORAD radar net had been tracking the Tu-142 Bear F for 91 minutes before it reached the Alaska ADIZ boundary. The Bear was not being subtle. A maritime patrol aircraft with a wingspan of 51 meters, 4 turboprop engines, flying at 21,000 feet on a bearing of 108 degrees toward the Alaskan coast. Its NK-12MV engines produced a propeller blade signature that the acoustic intelligence system had been logging since it left Tixie. The Bear was loud in every spectrum that mattered. It had been doing this since 1956. The approach was provocation by tradition.
What was not traditional was the MiG-31BM flying 180 kilometers behind it.
The Zaslon-M radar had been in active search mode since 6:21 a.m., sweeping a cone of coverage 200 kilometers wide ahead of the formation. The MiG-31 crew was not flying a combat air patrol in the conventional sense. They were flying a goalkeeper position, hanging at 62,000 feet behind the Bear, Mach 1.9, covering the Bear's rear approach hemisphere with a radar that could detect any intercepting aircraft at ranges that would give the crew time to position and release before the interceptor could close to engagement geometry. In 23 previous Bear approaches to the Alaska ADIZ over the past 4 years, the response had been F-22s or F-35s closing to escort the Bear from visual range, photographing the aircraft, and maintaining station until the Bear reversed course. The interceptions were publicized, predictable, and professionally unremarkable. The Russian crews knew the response pattern. The MiG-31 crew had been briefed on it in detail. They had planned around it. At 6:33 a.m., NORAD's J-STARS picture showed the MiG-31 at bearing 298, 180 kilometers behind the Bear, altitude 62,000 feet. The Bear was 94 kilometers from the ADIZ boundary. At current speed, the Bear would cross the boundary in 11 minutes and 40 seconds. The MiG-31's Zaslon-M radar was covering the intercept corridor that any responding aircraft from Elmendorf Air Reserve Base would have to use to reach the Bear. The standard intercept corridor was not being used. The F-22A Raptor from the third wing had been airborne for 37 minutes, launched from Elmendorf at 5:56 a.m. on a bearing of 015, northeast toward the coast at an altitude of 500 feet and a speed that produced no contrail signature above the overcast layer sitting at 8,000 feet over the Beaufort Sea. Not the direct route to the Bear, a route that kept the F-22 below the MiG-31's Zaslon-M radar horizon for as long as the geometry allowed. The terrain masking from the Brooks Range to the east had provided 22 minutes of additional cover on the initial departure leg. The F-22 had climbed above the overcast only when the geometry required it, and only to altitudes where the Zaslon-M's detection range against the F-22's radar cross-section was, according to the pre-mission planning model, below reliable tracking threshold. The planning model had a confidence band. The confidence band was the part of the mission brief that neither the pilot nor the intelligence officer had discussed at length, because the Zaslon-M's actual performance against the F-22's radar cross-section in actual Arctic atmospheric conditions existed in classified assessments with wide uncertainty margins. The model said the F-22 was undetected. The model's confidence, approximately 78%. 22% of the probability distribution was a MiG-31 crew that already knew the F-22 was there. At 6:34 a.m., the F-22 was at 41,000 feet, bearing 186 from the MiG-31, range 218 kilometers. The AN/APG-77 radar was in passive mode, no emissions, sensor receive only. The EW suite was reading the Zaslon-M's emissions with the precision of a system that had been cataloging that specific radar's pulse characteristics for decades. The Zaslon-M was in wide sector search, sweeping the southern and southeastern sectors of the formation's approach corridor. Not the northern sector, not the bearing from which the F-22 was approaching. At 218 kilometers, the F-22's passive suite had the MiG-31's position to within 2.1 kilometers. The MiG-31's Zaslon-M had not resolved the F-22 as a discrete contact. The geometry was working. The first thing visible from the cockpit at 41,000 feet over the Beaufort Sea in September was the horizon, which was not a single line but a gradation, the absolute black of space above, transitioning through the deep cobalt of near space, through a band of electric blue, to the pale cyan of the lower stratosphere, and then abruptly the white-gray of the overcast deck 33,000 feet below. No surface was visible. No water, no ice, no land. The world below the overcast existed only as a radar picture and a navigation reference. The world above was stars and the faint curvature of the Earth at the edges of the canopy. The cockpit temperature, 19 degrees Celsius, maintained against -63 outside. The engine's sound, absent from the cockpit in any conventional sense, transmitted instead as a low-frequency vibration through the seat and the rudder pedals, the F-119 turbofan's character expressed in hertz rather than decibels. The oxygen mask, a constant slight resistance on each inhale, the regulator pressure feedback that tells an experienced pilot the system is working without requiring any conscious attention. Breathing in a fighter cockpit at altitude is a monitored biological process. It does not feel like breathing anywhere else. At 6:41 a.m., the geometry arrived at its first critical point. Range from the F-22 to the MiG-31, 142 kilometers. At 142 kilometers, the Zaslon-M's documented detection range against a target with the F-22's radar cross-section, in the most optimistic open-source estimate, was approximately 120 to 140 kilometers. The F-22 was at the edge of the uncertainty band. The Zaslon-M was still sweeping its primary coverage sector to the southeast, still not covering the northern bearing, still not finding anything. The AN/APG-77 activated in low probability of intercept mode at 6:41 a.m. and 20 seconds. The APG-77's LPI characteristics were the reason the F-22's radar was specifically designated as LPI in its operational documentation: compressed pulse duration, frequency agility across a wide band, power management that kept the transmitted energy below the detection threshold of most radar warning receivers at ranges where conventional radars would be easily detectable. Against the Zaslon-M's passive detection capability, the ability of the MiG-31's radar system to detect the F-22's radar emissions rather than its own returns, the APG-77's LPI mode provided a meaningful but not absolute advantage. The Zaslon-M's passive detection capability was assessed in intelligence reports as moderate. Whether moderate meant below the APG-77's LPI threshold in these conditions was a number the intelligence reports had not settled. The LPI mode built a fire control solution on the MiG-31 in 6.8 seconds, range 141.4 kilometers, altitude 62,100 feet, speed Mach 1.88, heading 108, bearing 186 from own aircraft. The R-37Ms on the MiG-31's inboard pylons, 2 confirmed on the pre-flight satellite imagery, 4 possible had not been released. The Zaslon-M was still in wide sector search mode. At 6:41 a.m. and 41 seconds, the first friction event, the APG-77's LPI mode dropped the MiG-31 from track for 11 seconds. Not jamming, the MiG-31 crew had not activated any electronic countermeasures. The loss was atmospheric, a layer of ionospheric disturbance over the magnetic pole that the mission weather brief had flagged as a possible factor in radar propagation above 50,000 feet, and that had materialized precisely at the altitude band where the LPI energy was propagating. 11 seconds. At Mach 1.88, the MiG-31 covered 6.9 kilometers in 11 seconds. The uncertainty in its position when the LPI mode reacquired, a 6.9 kilometer sphere centered on the last confirmed track point. The F-22's supercruise had been sustaining Mach 1.5 without afterburner for 22 minutes. The capability that made the F-22's approach geometry fundamentally different from any other fighter that could have been tasked with this intercept. Supercruise, supersonic speed without the infrared plume of afterburner, without the fuel consumption rate that would have forced an earlier bingo threshold, and without the contrail that afterburner produces at altitude. At Mach 1.5 supercruise, the F-22 was covering 475 meters per second in near total electronic silence. The fuel flow at supercruise compared to afterburner, 40% lower. The detection signature, orders of magnitude smaller. The F-22's estimated development and procurement cost, $143 million per aircraft. Its operating cost, approximately $85,000 per flight hour. 37 minutes of flight time to this point, approximately $52,700. The alternative to having this specific aircraft available for this specific geometry, a conventional fighter using afterburner to close from a direct intercept bearing against a MiG-31 goalkeeper holding an R-37M, was a tactical problem with no clean solution at any cost.
At 6:44 a.m., range to MiG-31, 98 kilometers.
The Zaslon-M mode changed. The shift was immediate on the EW display. From wide sector search to a narrowed scan pattern, the beam focusing toward the northern sector. Not the F-22's exact bearing, 12 degrees off, covering a corridor slightly east of the F-22's actual position. But the Zaslon-M was no longer pointing away. The MiG-31 crew had something. Not a confirmed contact. A return at the edge of the detection envelope, inconsistent with atmospheric clutter, but insufficient to trigger the automatic target classification algorithm at this range. The pilot held course. Any deviation from the current vector would change the aspect angle the F-22 presented to the Zaslon-M and potentially increase the radar cross-section from the current near-frontal geometry to a side aspect that the Zaslon-M was significantly more capable of resolving. Holding course meant accepting that the Zaslon-M's narrowing scan was pointing closer to the actual bearing. It was the correct decision, and it required approximately 3 seconds of the specific internal stillness that separates trained response from reactive correction.
At 6:44 a.m. and 52 seconds, the Zaslon-M returned to wide sector search mode.
The anomalous return had not resolved into a trackable contact. Whatever the MiG-31's radar processing had flagged, it had not met the threshold for crew action. The pilot registered the Zaslon-M's return to search mode on the EW display and did not adjust speed or heading. The fire control solution on the MiG-31 rebuilt in 4.2 seconds after the LPI reactivation. Range 91 kilometers, confidence 74%.
91 kilometers. The R-37M's maximum engagement range, 300 kilometers. The F-22 was already inside 1/3 of that range and closing. The MiG-31 crew had not confirmed a contact, but the geometry was compressing fast. At 6:47 a.m., range to MiG-31, 63 kilometers. The F-22 was now inside the R-37M's effective engagement envelope. If the MiG-31 crew could resolve the F-22 as a confirmed contact and execute a launch sequence, an R-37M released from this range would reach intercept geometry in under 40 seconds. The F-22's defensive systems, the AN/ALR-94 radar warning system with its 30-plus antennas distributed across the airframe, would detect the Zaslon-M's targeting lock before the R-37M left the rail. Response time from lock detection to the F-22's first defensive maneuver, approximately 0.8 seconds trained response. Whether 0.8 seconds was enough to defeat an R-37M at 63 kilometers was a question no publicly available analysis had answered definitively.
The goal was not to test that question. The goal was to reach the ring.
At 6:48 a.m., the Zaslon-M shifted to single target track. The RWR tone arrived simultaneously in the pilot's helmet and on the EW display, a high-frequency narrowband emission from bearing 006, consistent with the Zaslon-M's fire control mode. Spike, spike, bandit 006 high. The MiG-31 crew had resolved the contact. They had a track. The R-37M's inertial guidance would be receiving the targeting data now. The launch sequence for the R-37M from confirmed track to weapons release was estimated at 8 to 12 seconds for a trained crew.
Range to MiG-31, 61 kilometers.
The F-22 did not turn, did not maneuver defensively, did not change altitude or speed. The geometry required 42 more seconds of straight-line closure at current speed to reach the 40-kilometer ring, the inner edge of the R-37M's estimated minimum engagement range. 42 seconds inside a Zaslon-M fire control track, inside the R-37M's engagement envelope, closing on a platform that was already in launch sequence. The APG-77 went to full power.
Not LPI, not passive. Full power AESA track mode, the most capable air-to-air radar in operational service, locking the MiG-31 at 60.8 kilometers with a fire control solution that reached full confidence in 1.4 seconds. The AIM-120D solution in the HMD, green, valid, range within parameters. The AN/ALR-94 simultaneously activated the F-22's electronic attack mode, a directed jamming signal on the Zaslon-M's operating frequency, targeting the radar's ability to maintain coherent track during the fire control sequence. The electronic attack from the F-22 did not need to break the Zaslon-M's lock entirely. It needed to introduce enough degradation into the fire control solution's confidence that the launch authorization threshold, the Zaslon-M's internal requirement for solution quality before enabling R-37M release, was not met during the 42 seconds remaining before the range crossed into the minimum engagement zone.
The jamming activated at 6:48 a.m. and 14 seconds. The Zaslon-M track tone on the RWR shifted character, from the steady, high-confidence warble of a locked fire control solution to an intermittent, lower-frequency pattern that the threat library characterized as a degraded track mode. The electronic attack was working, not breaking the lock, degrading it. The MiG-31 crew's response arrived in 3.1 seconds. The Zaslon-M's frequency shifted, the radar hopping to a secondary operating band in an attempt to escape the jamming signal. The AN/ALR-94 had been designed for exactly this response. The frequency hop was anticipated. The counter-jamming shifted to track the new operating frequency in 0.4 seconds. The MiG-31 crew shifted again. The ALR-94 followed in 0.3 seconds. An electronic duel at 58 kilometers, both crews working their systems at the highest tempo available to them, the outcome determined by which side's technology could sustain coherent operation under deliberate interference at this range and geometry. The second friction event arrived at 6:48 a.m. and 51 seconds. The F-22's electronic attack system flagged a power management conflict with the APG-77's simultaneous full-power transmit mode. Both systems were drawing from the same electrical generation architecture, and the combined demand at maximum output briefly exceeded the management threshold. The system resolved the conflict automatically in 1.9 seconds by momentarily reducing the APG-77's transmit power by 18%. The fire control solution confidence dropped from 94 to 71% during the 1.9-second window. Then both systems stabilized at a shared power allocation and the confidence rebuilt. 1.9 seconds. Range to MiG-31 during those 1.9 seconds, crossing through 55 kilometers. The Zaslon-M track tone on the RWR went from degraded intermittent to absent at 6:49 a.m. and 8 seconds. Not broken, absent. The Zaslon-M had dropped the track entirely, the jamming having accumulated enough interference in the fire control solution that the system's automatic quality threshold had suspended the targeting lock. The MiG-31 crew would be switching to backup modes, attempting to reacquire, their launch window compressing with each second that the solution was not confirmed.
Range to MiG-31, 49 kilometers.
At 6:49 a.m. and 31 seconds, range 44 kilometers, the F-22 transmitted on guard frequency. Foxhound, Foxhound. You are being tracked at 44 kilometers by a U.S. Air Force aircraft. You have entered the Alaska Air Defense Identification Zone approach corridor. Reverse course immediately. This is your final advisory. The guard transmission served two purposes. The declared one, the International Emergency Frequency Advisory that NORAD procedures required at this stage of an ADIZ intercept. The tactical one, the MiG-31 crew now knew with certainty what the Zaslon-M's degraded picture had been suggesting for the past 90 seconds. They were 44 kilometers from an aircraft they could not track, which was tracking them, which had been jamming their fire control radar for the past 78 seconds, and which was now inside the range band where their primary long-range ordnance could not complete a valid engagement geometry. The R-37M at 44 kilometers, outside its minimum effective range. The AIM-120D at 44 kilometers, well within its optimal parameters.
The geometry had inverted.
The MiG-31 crew's response came in 6 seconds from the end of the guard transmission. The Zaslon-M went to standby, no emissions. The MiG-31's heading changed. A left bank, wings loaded to an estimated 3G for a crew in an airframe not designed for sustained maneuvering. The nose pulling northwest, away from the bearing of the guard transmission. Not afterburner immediately. The MiG-31's turn radius at this speed and altitude was large, and the energy management of the turn was deliberate. The aircraft was built for speed and altitude, not for the rolling scissors of a WVR engagement. Its escape geometry was a sustained turn to put distance between itself and the 44-kilometer contact, then acceleration back toward the northwest and home. The Tu-142 Bear, monitoring the formation frequency, began its own turn 15 seconds after the MiG-31's bank initiated. The Bear turned north, the lumbering maritime patrol aircraft's heading changed slow and wide. A 51-meter wingspan aircraft at 21,000 feet, turboprops reducing to cruise power as the crew followed the abort protocol. The Bear had crossed 11 kilometers inside the ADIZ boundary before turning. It would be 34 kilometers inside before its new heading actually began opening range to the boundary. The F-22 held the MiG-31 track through the turn. Fire control solution, green. The MiG-31's aspect angle was now changing rapidly as it executed its turn, the radar cross-section cycling through values as the aircraft rotated through aspects. At its largest side-on aspect, the MiG-31 presented approximately 14 square meters to the APG-77. At 41 kilometers in opening, the fire control solution was precise and clean. The solution was not employed. The geometry had made the point that the mission brief required. At 6:52 a.m., the MiG-31 was at 61 kilometers and opening, heading 322, Zaslon-M in standby, speed increasing through Mach 2.1 in afterburner. The Bear was at 44 kilometers and reversing north. Both contacts were aggressing. The F-22 maintained passive track on both aircraft for 4 additional minutes, watching the range numbers increase with the steady geometry of retreat. At 6:56 a.m., the lead transmitted on the tactical frequency. Eagle Control, Raptor flight. Both contacts aggressing. Bear bearing 015 at 68 miles, reversing north. Foxhound bearing 322 at 81 miles, northwest. ADIZ boundary not crossed. No ordnance employed. Fuel state bingo +17. RTB in progress.
The response from the NORAD controller, 2 words.
Bingo +17. Supercruise efficiency had preserved more fuel margin than afterburner-based geometry would have permitted. 1 hour of total flight at $85,000 per flight hour. $85,000. The R-37M rounds the MiG-31 crew carried and never released. Approximately $1 million each by Russian procurement estimates, $2 million of ordnance that spent the entire engagement launch ready and never received a valid fire control solution. The mathematics of the R-37M's minimum engagement range had been paid for at the design stage. Exploiting that mathematics required an aircraft that could close 300 kilometers of contested airspace without being tracked, and an electronic warfare system capable of degrading a fire control solution faster than a trained crew could compensate. The total U.S. investment that made both capabilities available, well over $100 million in a single airframe, and decades of electronic warfare development that had no equivalent line item in any public budget document. The descent from 41,000 feet began at 6:57 a.m. The F-22 reduced to subsonic speed below 30,000 feet. The transition from supercruise to cruise, marked by a subtle change in the airframe's vibration character that an experienced pilot reads automatically. The Beaufort Sea below the overcast was not visible. The cloud deck was solid, but the radar altimeter showed the surface at 9,400 feet below the base of the weather, the ice and dark water of September in the high Arctic. The pilot sat in the cockpit at 24,000 feet on the descent and noted the following in the deliberate inventory that a post-engagement review requires. The Zaslon-M had found the anomalous return at 98 kilometers, closer than the pre-mission planning model's 78% confidence case had assumed was likely. The second frequency hop in the electronic duel had been faster than the threat intelligence assessed as probable. The power management conflict between the APG-77 and the electronic attack mode had not appeared in any simulator session or exercise. The 1.9-second solution confidence drop during that conflict, at the range and geometry where the engagement was most compressed, was the margin that the mission summary would note.
The debrief would work through each of those numbers. The intelligence analysts who received the mission data package, APG-77 LPI performance returns, Zaslon-M frequency hop timing, electronic attack degradation curves, would update the assessments that future mission briefs relied on. The 78% confidence band would be revised. The number that replaced it would be classified and would inform every F-22 Arctic intercept planned until the next data point was collected.
At 62,000 feet over the Beaufort Sea, a MiG-31 crew was flying northwest at Mach 2.1 in afterburner, the Zaslon-M in standby, the R-37M rounds still on their rails in the cold and the dark. They had been in a valid launch position for 11 seconds before the jamming degraded their fire control solution. They had spent those 11 seconds working their systems against interference from an aircraft they had located at 98 kilometers but never confirmed to the standard their targeting computer required. 11 seconds. Whether the geometry would have permitted a valid launch before the range closed inside the minimum engagement zone was a calculation that existed on both sides of the debrief table. The MiG-31 crew's version of that calculation would never be published anywhere. 2 aircraft, 41,000 feet, 218 kilometers from initial passive track to fire control solution, 23 minutes from engagement initiation to both contacts egressing. Airspace yielded, 0. Ordnance employed, 0. R-37M launch window opened, 11 seconds. R-37M launch window closed by geometry, confirmed. Message delivered, the goalkeeper has a minimum range. Someone on the other side knows exactly where it is. At 7:14 a.m., the F-22 touched down at Elmendorf. The Arctic above the Beaufort Sea was empty and clear and absolutely silent at 41,000 feet, the contrail from one aircraft already fading in the still cold air. In 30 minutes, it would be gone. The sky would show no record of what had happened there. The radar tapes would show all of it in precise electromagnetic detail, forever.